New South Wales Police have this morning released new security footage as they investigate the fatal shooting of a man in Sydney's southwest. The vision shows a car driving through a Greenacre street before 39-year-old Mahmoud Ahmad is shot. Police believe there are still people yet to come forward with information.
You've just watched it. The grainy CCTV footage that shook Sydney. The ambush was swift, calculated, and brutal. A black Porsche Cayenne crept along a quiet Greenacre street before erupting in gunfire, striking down Mahmoud Brownie Ahmad in a storm of bullets. For months, Brownie had been a man on the run, a marked figure in the underworld, living in fear, yet refusing to disappear. His fate was sealed long before the shots rang out. But this wasn't just a gangland hit. This was the unraveling of a criminal dynasty that once commanded fear across Sydney's southwest. The Ahmad family had built its empire through drug trafficking, extortion, and raw intimidation. A name whispered in courtrooms, prison yards, and suburban alleyways alike. At the center of it all stood Brownie, the enforcer, the connector, the one who kept everything together, until it all fell apart. What led to that moment on the pavement? Who stood to gain? And how did a family rise so far only to come undone in a hail of bullets? This is the story of the Ahmad crime family and the high price of power in the Australian underworld. To understand Mahmoud Brownie Ahmad, you need to understand where he came from, a place where loyalty isn't optional and reputation is everything. The Ahmad family roots trace back to Bankstown in Sydney's southwest. It's an area often romanticized as multicultural and close-knit. But behind closed doors, it's also where power is brokered on the street, not in boardrooms. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the name Ahmad began to carry weight, not in politics, not in business, but in whispered conversations at kebab shops, gyms, and street corners. At the center of it all was Wali Ahmad, Brownie's older brother, charismatic, ruthless, and connected. Wali became a household name in criminal circles, known for his role in drug trafficking and his unshakable presence in the community. He was both feared and strangely admired, the type of figure who could settle a score with a phone call or a bullet. Brownie, younger and more physically imposing, followed in his brother's footsteps, first as muscle, then as a shot caller in his own right. Unlike Wali, who worked the network, Brownie enforced it. He was the one you didn't want knocking on your door. Known for his short temper and direct approach, he quickly earned a reputation as the family's most dangerous asset. But with power came enemies. And in Sydney's crime world, enemies don't forget. By the early 2010s, the Ahmad family had extended their influence beyond Bankstown. They were allegedly involved in multi-million-dollar drug operations, extortion rackets, and violent retribution hits. If someone crossed them, the message would be loud and brutal. At one point, their name was mentioned alongside some of the most feared crime syndicates in the country, from the Hamzy and Alameddine networks to outlaw bikie gangs. Still, it wasn't all bloodshed and bullets. The Ahmads cultivated their own kind of fame: flashy cars, designer clothes, social media images that flaunted wealth, brotherhood, and untouchability. To the public, they were both celebrities and cautionary tales. But behind the bravado was a family walking a tightrope. Each deal, each feud, each show of strength pushed them further into the crosshairs, not just of rivals, but of police task forces determined to shut them down. Still, for a while, the name Ahmad stood tall. Brownie, Wali, and their associates moved like kings in their part of the city. That wouldn't last. The cracks were already showing. And soon, one family's empire would become Sydney's most violent cautionary tale. With bloodlines firmly rooted in Sydney's southwest, the Ahmad family didn't just survive in the underworld, they thrived. What started as neighborhood dominance in Bankstown evolved into something much larger. By the mid-2000s teens, they weren't just local enforcers. They were major players. And the streets knew it. Their business, drugs, mostly cocaine and meth, moved in massive quantities. The scale of their operation wasn't just about street sales. The Ahmads allegedly had access to full importation networks running through Sydney's ports and linked with transnational suppliers from the Middle East and Asia. The profits were staggering, so were the stakes. Mahmoud Brownie Ahmad, now operating as the family's most visible and feared figure, handled disputes with force. If someone shorted the Ahmads, they didn't send a warning. They sent Brownie, and he didn't knock. He kicked indoors, left bodies on pavements, and made sure no one dared test them again. But violence wasn't the only tool. There was strategy. The Ahmad network began linking up with outlaw motorcycle gangs, particularly those with access to logistics and firepower. They also had associates in Western Sydney's Lebanese and Middle Eastern crews, groups that knew how to keep quiet and handle business in-house. And while Task Force Erebus was watching, the Ahmads stayed smart. They used burner phones, safe houses, encrypted apps, and shell companies to mask cash flow. Money was laundered through shisha bars, garages, and sometimes even through online businesses. The image they projected on the surface? Family men, religious, respected, but everyone in the game knew the truth. Social media added a dangerous twist. Brownie and others began flaunting luxury, designer brands, high-end vehicles, stacks of cash, private gyms. It wasn't just about ego, it was branding, fear marketing. Every Instagram post was a reminder, we run this. And for a while, they did. The streets talked. Rumors swirled of police raids finding automatic weapons, of nightclubs being taxed for protection, of rivals disappearing. It all built the Ahmad myth, a family you didn't cross, a name you didn't say unless you wanted heat. But inside that empire, cracks were forming. Rival crews, especially the Hamzi and Alameddine families, were rising fast. Old truces were breaking. Younger soldiers were getting reckless. The streets were changing, and the Ahmads were now seen as targets, not just threats. Still, in the chaos of Sydney's underworld, the Ahmad name continued to command attention. But with rising power came rising pressure, from both enemies and law enforcement. The empire was expanding, but so was the list of people waiting for it to fall. And Brownie? He was walking straight into the storm. By late 2020, the streets of Sydney were shifting. What once felt like an empire under Ahmad control was now beginning to slip. The air was different, colder, quieter. Eyes watched from shadows. And Brownie Ahmad could feel it. He wasn't paranoid. He was being hunted. The cracks began with the rivals. The Hamzi and Alameddine families, once lesser threats, were now building their own networks, leaner, younger, and just as ruthless. Shootings in Western Sydney were no longer rare. They were routine. Houses were sprayed with bullets, cars torched, innocents caught in the crossfire. The war was no longer about respect. It was about survival. Brownie, still the enforcer at heart, responded the only way he knew how. With dominance. He doubled down on loyalty checks. He moved through safe houses like a ghost. Rumors swirled he was never in the same place 2 nights in a row, but deep down he knew the truth. Someone was going to flip. Or worse, someone already had. Task Force Erebus, the New South Wales Police's specialized unit targeting Middle Eastern crime gangs, had been building a case. Phone taps, surveillance drones, flipped associates. The walls were closing in, and Brownie wasn't just a suspect, he was the prize. But the pressure wasn't just external. The weight of the empire was fracturing the family from within. Younger foot soldiers, eager for status, were taking reckless steps. Turf disputes turned into full-blown firefights. Every move, every deal, now carried risk. And for Brownie, there was no safety net. Then came the hits. 2 close associates of the Ahmad family were gunned down in quick succession, one while driving, the other while stepping out of his home. Brownie was rattled. The message was clear. We know where you are, and we're getting closer. Police confirmed what the streets already knew. There was a bounty on Brownie's head. $1 million. No questions asked, paid in full. Rival crews wanted him gone, And it didn't matter who pulled the trigger, someone would. At this point, Brownie disappeared. He stopped using phones, stopped showing up to his usual spots. Even police began to lose track of his movements. Reports suggested he was bouncing between Western Sydney, rural properties, and even safe houses funded by allies still loyal to the Ahmad name. But the silence didn't mean safety. It meant the noose was tightening. For Sydney's underworld, the shooting war was escalating. And for Brownie, every day he stayed alive was a small victory. But that victory wouldn't last. The streets were colder than ever, and someone was waiting. Mahmoud Brownie Ahmad had survived stabbings, prison, and power struggles, but nothing compared to what he faced in 2022. There wasn't just a target on his back, there was a $1 million price tag on his head. This was no rumor. Detectives confirmed it during press conferences. The bounty was real, and it had turned the streets into a hunting ground. Rivals, former associates, even freelancers, anyone with a weapon and a motive now had a reason to chase down the most wanted man in Sydney's criminal underworld. For Brownie, every day was war. He lived in safe houses, swapped vehicles constantly, and avoided using phones or staying more than one night in the same place. Police later revealed he had gone to ground, completely off the grid. But off the grid doesn't mean out of danger. The paranoia ran deep. He didn't trust many. Even those in his inner circle were viewed with suspicion. The $1 million bounty had poisoned everything. Friendships, alliances, even family ties. Who could resist a payout like that? It wasn't just rivals closing in. New South Wales police were tightening the net. Task Force Erebus had dedicated full-time resources to tracking Brownie's movements. Undercover surveillance, digital traces, financial audits. They wanted him not just because of his past, but because they knew something bigger was coming. Brownie was living on borrowed time, and everyone, cops, crooks, and civilians, knew it. He reportedly tried to lay low, even discussing the possibility of fleeing overseas. But it was too late. He was too infamous. Too many people wanted a piece of him, or wanted him gone. Despite the risks, Brownie couldn't fully step away. There were debts to collect, messages to send, control to maintain. He was a boss, but he was also a soldier, and stepping out of the game would be seen as weakness. In the weeks leading up to his death, there were multiple sightings. Some claimed to have seen him at a shisha bar in Punchbowl. Others said he was moving between homes in Western Sydney, protected by a small circle of loyalists. But with every move he made, the walls drew tighter. There were whispers that information had been leaked, that someone close had given up details, addresses, vehicles, routines. And with that, the manhunt turned lethal. Brownie wasn't just another underworld figure anymore. He was a symbol of power, defiance, and now, impending collapse. The bounty hadn't just made him a target. It had turned him into dead man walking. April 27, 2022. The night it all ended. It was just past 9:30 p.m. in Greenacre, a quiet pocket of Sydney's southwest. The streets were still. The only sounds were distant traffic and the occasional hum of a passing car. Brownie Ahmad stood near a white Toyota Hilux, casually chatting, unaware, or perhaps resigned, that this would be the last conversation of his life. Then came the black Porsche Cayenne. CCTV footage, later released by NSW police, captures it all in chilling detail. The Porsche rolls into frame slowly, almost silently. There's no rush, no panic, just cold calculation. As it passes the Hilux, the first flash of gunfire erupts from the window. Then another. Then another. Brownie is hit instantly. Bullets tear through the quiet night, and he crumples to the pavement. There's a pause. A second barrage follows. The shooters don't just want him gone, they want it to be final. The Porsche then turns the corner and vanishes into the darkness. It was an ambush, perfectly timed, professionally executed. No warning, no hesitation. Within minutes, the scene is chaos. Sirens, flashing lights, bystanders in shock. Brownie Ahmad, the man who ruled by fear, now lay lifeless on the asphalt. Within 48 hours, police linked the getaway vehicle, the Porsche, to a theft reported nearly a year earlier in Carlingford. By the next morning, it had been found burned out in a nearby suburb. A classic move. Evidence destroyed. But this wasn't just another gangland killing. This was a high-profile execution, the kind that sends ripples through the entire criminal ecosystem. It was the death of a kingpin, a statement, and no one was claiming credit, at least not publicly. Police arrested 4 men in connection with the murder, but they were quick to clarify. The triggerman, or men, remained at large. Task Force Erebus intensified its efforts, pushing for more witnesses, more footage, more intel. They believed there were more people involved, and they were right. Detective Superintendent Danny Doherty called the hit indiscriminate, not because Brownie wasn't the intended target, but because it happened on a residential street. Anyone could have been killed. It wasn't just a gang message. It was reckless violence in the open. The aftermath? Silence. Streets emptied. Those who once stood behind the Ahmad name were suddenly quiet. That's what happens when the top falls. Loyalty gets fragile. For years, Brownie Ahmad had ruled with force. But in the end, all it took was 30 seconds, a stolen car, and a couple of gunmen with a payday promise. One of the most feared men in Sydney's underworld was taken out like he never mattered. And the message was heard loud and clear. No one is untouchable. When Mahmoud Brownie Ahmad hit the pavement in Greenacre, the echoes of the gunfire didn't stop with him. They reverberated through the entire underworld. For years, the Ahmad name had carried weight, not just in Bankstown, but across Sydney's criminal map. But with their most feared enforcer lying dead on the street, the empire began to crumble. Brownie wasn't just a member of the family. He was the glue that held the chaos together. Without him, old alliances broke. Protection dried up. Debts went unpaid. And worst of all, the fear that had shielded them for years began to fade. Police knew it. So did their rivals. Task Force Erebus ramped up operations. Raids swept through Western Sydney. Guns, cash, encrypted phones, and luxury cars were seized. Associates were picked off, one by one. Some flipped, some vanished. Others tried to hold ground. But without the muscle of Brownie or the leadership of Wali Ahmad, there was no center to hold. Wali, of course, had been executed years earlier in a daylight shooting on the rooftop of a Bankstown gym, another brutal chapter in the family's violent history. His murder, like Brownie's, sent shockwaves, but Brownie's hit marked the collapse. The Ahmads weren't finished, not entirely, but they weren't what they used to be. Their name, once spoken with caution, was now linked more to tragedy than terror. Investigations tied them to numerous unsolved shootings, extortion plots, and failed drug imports. But without their key operators, the prosecution efforts became easier. The intimidation factor gone. Meanwhile, Sydney's criminal balance shifted. With the Ahmads weakened, rival families expanded. The Alameddines and Hamzis stepped up. Younger crews filled the vacuum. And with that rise came a new kind of chaos. One that didn't respect the old codes, one more reckless, more public, and more unpredictable. And yet, for all the bloodshed, one thing remains constant in Sydney's underworld. Nothing stays silent for long. Another name always rises. Another story begins. But the Ahmad family? Their chapter became a cautionary tale of what happens when power turns to paranoia and when a legacy built on violence is met with more violence. In the end, Brownie Ahmad's fate wasn't a surprise. It was a countdown. A man with too many enemies, too much visibility, and too many people waiting to collect. A kingpin silenced in the street. A family left in ruins. And a city, once again, reminded. The streets may forget the faces, but they never forget the debt.